Hello and welcome to IB Times TV. I'm Leanna Brinded, Senior Business Journalist for the International Business Times. Joining me now is Ivo de Boer. He's the former Executive Secretary for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and is now the Special Global Advisor on Climate Change and Sustainability at KPMG. Thanks for joining us, Ivo. So to kick off, since you left the UNFCCC in July 2010, how have you viewed the progression of global talks and agreements when it comes to climate change? And do you think enough has been done, or are there any ticking time bombs when it comes to some of these agreements?
Well, there was a massive climate change conference in Copenhagen about 3 years ago now that a lot of politicians from around the world came to, really expecting an international agreement on climate change, which of course didn't happen. And I think since then a lot of political people certainly have had an almost Copenhagen hangover. That's one aspect. Secondly, of course, we've since then slipped into a pretty deep part, hopefully the deepest part of an economic crisis, which is reaching around the world. And that has led to politicians being focused very much on economic issues rather than on climate change related issues. And perhaps as a consequence of that, the international talks have been progressing very slowly. We're not seeing the kind of progress that we need. And I think the thing that worries me most about that is the fact that a number of years ago, politicians said they want to maximize average global temperature increase at 2 degrees centigrade. And I'm very much afraid that that goal is now out of reach given the lack of global action.
Okay, and in terms of the recent talks in Durban, there have been a few concerns around the market in terms of the wording of the agreement. How did you view those talks, and are there any warnings you would say that could arise over the next year?
I think since a number of years ago, when markets were still perceived with a great deal of suspicion, especially by developing countries, that situation has fundamentally changed, that countries from around the world now recognize that market-based mechanisms need to be part of the solution to climate change. And in fact, you see more and more developing countries, including, interestingly, China, beginning to look at carbon trading, emissions trading as part of the solution.
Okay, and talking about these market mechanisms, 2013 is a really key year for the EU ETS because we've moved into phase 3. And that phase 3 is radically different to the first 2 phases. But do you still think it's balanced enough and protected from the problems that arose from the first 2 phases?
Well, let's see. I mean, the problem with the ETS has been partly of its own making, in the sense that we've seen a significant over-allocation of emission rights in the past, and a lot of European industries being exempted because of their exposure to international competition. So those are 2 things which I think need to be adjusted as the scheme progresses. And then, of course, there have been some things which are external to the emissions trading scheme, which is mainly related to the state of the economy in Europe. So I suppose we're in a situation at the moment where we have too many emission rights being allocated, the price being too low, and as a consequence the system not doing what it's supposed to do, namely create scarcity in the market. And that's going to be one of the main challenges for the future, to really ensure that there is the demand that drives change in the direction that we want to go.
So carbon trading and several other market mechanisms that help tackle climate change are of course relatively new in the grand scheme of things. So auditing and tax are really key components in order to stay kosher and run your businesses properly under a new market environment. But how do you view auditing and tax as a use of a forward-looking tool?
Well, I think you've touched on exactly the right point. I mean, it's one thing to use a report, an audit, to look back in time, to look at your performance in the past. What we think at KPMG is far more interesting is to use an audit to look forward. So in other words, how can you use an audit to understand what opportunities you're missing, where there are opportunities to reduce costs, to be more efficient. In other words, really use an audit as a forward-looking instrument that allows you to develop your business strategy in a more sustainable direction. And we're increasingly finding actually interest from companies to do that. Basically, if I, in my KPMG role now, talk to clients, they're looking at sustainability or climate from 3 perspectives. The first is how can they use climate and sustainability to grow, to develop new products and services for new markets. A second lens that they use is how can they use action on sustainability or climate change to increase efficiency and to reduce cost by using less energy, using less water, or managing their supply chain more effectively. And the third area that businesses are increasingly focusing on is how important is sustainability to the value of their brand? Are they really being good citizens in society? Do they have the right employment policies?
Okay, and speaking, I suppose, of forward-looking, last year KPMG did actually a big benchmark report called Expect the Unexpected. And so from that report, what were the key global challenges that were highlighted within that? And a year on, have any of those points been either ignored or not tackled properly, or have maybe been exacerbated in some way?
Well, what we did in the context of that report was look at a number of global megatrends on climate change, of course, but also on energy prices, on water, on food scarcity, on the loss of ecosystems, the loss of biodiversity, a number of challenges that are being exacerbated, being made worse by this massive population growth, massive wealth increase around the world, especially in developing economies, and massive urbanization as well. And those really are global trends which I see businesses increasingly taking into account, that they recognize that raw materials are becoming more scarce, that we need to be more creative in how we produce things and put them into the market, how we organize our supply chain. So I actually see the business community becoming increasingly aware of those global trends. The biggest problem, I think, is certainly in the area of climate change, that we're still not pricing pollution properly, that you can still emit greenhouse gases at a very low cost. And that makes it very, very difficult, for example, for new renewable energy technology to compete in the marketplace.
And on that point exactly, I mean, a lot of fast emerging countries, whether it's China or India, and obviously business that are very intrinsic to those countries' growth, they've been, I suppose, a little less positive when it comes to market mechanisms or new policies for climate change and sustainability. But how do you see actually carving these new kind of mechanisms for them, or them participating in existing ones, to actually help economic growth overall?
Well, what I see is that countries like China, India, South Africa, Brazil are perhaps reluctant to take a legal commitment in the context of a climate treaty, but that does not mean that they're not acting on climate and energy alone. I mean, to give you a few examples, China is in the process of putting an emissions trading scheme in place in a number of its provinces. India has developed a tradable energy efficiency certificate scheme. South Africa is discussing a carbon tax at this moment in time. So you do actually see developing countries acting on climate, exploring the possibility of market-based mechanisms, because they recognize that their energy bill, just like everyone else's, is continuing to increase, and that they need to address not issues of energy alone, but issues of climate change as well.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
That was Yvo de Boer, former Executive Secretary for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and now Special Global Advisor for KPMG.